Good evening, Crime Time Inc. listeners. And I've got a very, very special guest tonight. I think you're our first international guest, Mike. Mike Bonventre in New York City tonight. How are you?
I'm good, but New York City is 200 miles east of me. Ohio is 200 miles west of me. I am dead center in the state of New York, and Pennsylvania is about 3 miles south of where I live.
You sound like a bit of a nomad, Mike, to be honest. Welcome to Crime Time Inc.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem. If I say that your book, Citizen Crime Fighter, is really the reason that I got to know about you and that we got in touch over social media, your new book, Citizen Crime Fighter. Before we talk about the book and your association with law enforcement there in New York State and New York City, let's get a wee bit of background, Mike, if you don't mind, because that's what leads into this, obviously. Tell us a bit about your family, where you're from, and the preamble to this, if you like.
Okay, we'll make a long story very short. In 1957, in the United States, there was a organized crime raid labeled the Appalachian Gangland Convention Raid in 1957. If you're familiar with the Godfather movie franchise, the meeting that all the five families had in that movie to divvy up their territories and to officially decide if they were going to get into the drug business was the whole purpose of that 1957 meeting that got raided. You have to picture very old, very chubby, out of shape wise guys running through a farmyard when the police came.
What's your interest in that meeting in 1957, Mike? Because I've got the benefit I can see you. And you were born about 1957, I would guess.
I was born that year, and my father started a pest control business that year, and he was an exterminator. And that year, they came to my father and said, "You're going to be in people's houses and businesses. We're going to make you a millionaire. All you have to do is tell us where the money, the jewelry, and the guns are, and leave the back door open." And my father said, "Kill me now, because that will never happen." Back in 1957, the old criminals still had some morals and ethics and common sense. So the older mafia bosses said, "Leave your hands off of Sam," my father, because they had businesses and friends and houses that all had bugs. And they said, "We want to know our exterminator is honest. We don't want him leaving our back door open for the highest bidder." So for 25 years, my father made a very good, honest living.
Can I ask you a question there, Mike? And obviously, you've got this passed down through family, through your father, and what you've learned since. But this is a different concept over here in the UK because the mafia really is a Hollywood thing to most UK. It would never believe some of the stuff that's real life. We've got a saying at Crime Timing that the truth is very often much, much more fascinating and strange than any fiction could ever be. What was the environment then with these mob bosses meeting in 57, dividing up territories? Was protection just a way of life, just the way it was?
You know, back in the 1910s and 1890s, the mafia was really formed to protect the Italian immigrants from the government. It was formed with good intentions. But then, like anything else, greed and bribery and drugs and everything else get involved, and good intentions turn into criminal empires. So when I was growing up, I knew these people because I worked with my father as an exterminator. I was in their houses, I was in their businesses, and it was, hi, how are you? And just a general knowledge of each other. Now, where I grew up, there was IBM, International Business Machines, originated in my hometown, 60,000 employees. There was also a shoe company that was in my hometown that was 95% Italian immigrants.
What was your hometown, Mike?
Endicott, New York.
Okay.
And so growing up, the mafia was part of the landscape. Everybody knew them and everybody knew of them, but nobody really got involved with them. They took advantage of big businesses and small businesses, and they gave protection. Now, you paid them to protect you against them. If you didn't pay them, they would burn your place down. But if you
Yeah.
did pay them, they would make sure no strangers burned your place down.
Okay.
So pretty much like the movies portray them.
So where did the unions fit into that, Mike, as well, just to give us a round picture?
The unions were huge. The mafia was in every single part of every labor union in the country. If you were building a building, you paid the mafia a tax on every window, every door, every inch of cement, every dumpster. So we'll fast forward from 1957 to 1982, where I turned 25 years old. My father wanted to sell his business. I went to California. I was 3,000 miles away. And when my father sold his business, after 25 years of not being picked on, somehow the lawyers and the accountants and everybody got involved. My father ended up walking away from his business sale with nothing, absolutely not a penny. They muscled the lawyers and embezzled my father's 25-year life. That was 1982 when our famous Teflon Don, John Gotti, was in the news. He was very flamboyant, and the government was cracking down on the Italian mafia. My father got an appointment with a very popular news show, 60 Minutes, and he was going to expose that he lost $1 million, that law enforcement would not help him, and that the bar association, the head of the lawyers, would not help him. So when that news got out that my father was going on TV, the mafia lawyer called my house and said to my father, "Come on down to my office. We have to talk. Things are getting out of control." Well, they must have had somebody watching, because right when my father left, the phone rang again, and my mother picked up the phone. And the mafia lawyer said to my mother, "If your husband goes on television, we're going to kill you and your children." Now, back in 1982, there were no cell phones.
Okay.
There were the old fashioned cassette tape recorders that gave the message and that recorded the message. Well, after the conversation, my mother hung up and realized she accidentally recorded the entire conversation of the mafia boss bragging about robbing my family business and threatening to kill us if my father didn't give up trying to get even. So she called me in California and said, "You have to come home right away. If your father listens to this, he'll do something really stupid and get us all killed. So please come home." So I came home and I took the tape to my local FBI agent, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. The agent met me outside of the federal building and said, "Mike, stop. We know all about your father getting embezzled. We know all about the threat to kill you and your family. Rip that tape up, burn it. Go home and tell your father to lick his wounds and get on with his life, or they will kill you, and we don't care. And I looked at him, and I'm 25 years old. I have no experience with law enforcement other than relatives and friends. So I said, well, wait a minute. Don't my tax dollars pay you to protect us? And he said, you are acceptable collateral damage in our 25-year investigation of these criminals. And then he explained to me how their budgets worked and how their long-term investigations worked and how their job security worked. So, of course, I walked away pretty much defeated with my head down. And as I was walking away, the FBI agent called me back. And he said, Michael, I want to make sure you understand me. Not only does your government not care about you and your family, I personally have a gravy job, and I personally will not let you interfere with our 25-year investigation. So I looked at him and I said, my grandmother used to say to me, if you have something to say it and shut up. Because if you continue to talk, you will say something wrong. And I said to the agent, I said, you, my friend, just made this personal. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to put an end to your job, your security, and your family's security before anybody kills me. So I got in the car and I looked in the rearview mirror and I said, whoa, that was pretty impressive. You idiot. You just threatened an FBI agent.
Can I go back a wee bit there, Mike,
Yes.
just to unpack some of it for our listeners? Because remember, the culture's completely different, and some of this stuff will sound like Hollywood to some of our listeners. This embezzlement to get your father's company, was that a paperwork trick? Was that accountants and lawyers? Or was it threats of violence and threats against customers and things like that?
Well, sure. The person my father was selling the business to was part African American and part Caucasian. So you would
Okay.
assume that he's not involved with the Italian mafia. What turned out to be the facts are this gentleman owed the Italian mafia thousands and thousands of dollars for gambling. So they said to him, win over Sam's confidence, make sure he sells the business to you. We'll take care of all your debts and all the legalities. So in the closing, my father initialed agreements, payment schedule, foreclosure schedule, collateral. Well, what they did after my father had left that closing, they changed the contract so blatantly that you could tell the paper didn't come from the same ream of paper. You could tell that the typewriter had different keys and the letters didn't even match. So next to his initials, they changed the agreements. So legally, he had a contract that he had signed and initialed that said he's got nothing coming. He just gave his 25-year business, and it was it would have been right around $1 million with interest and payments.
I'm just trying to get the culture because it's very strange for us. I don't know if you're aware or not, but I've got an organisation I'm part of, and I started here in Scotland called the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. And our interest is in getting our drug laws changed, our so-called war on drugs laws from 1971. Thanks to you guys, thanks to President Nixon, actually, but Another podcast entirely.
I'm very familiar with that organization. When they started, they were called LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition.
That's correct. That's correct. And we will come back to that, hopefully, maybe in another podcast.
Sure.
But what I was going to ask you was that I did a talk yesterday. I do talks most weeks to organisations, anyone that will listen, really. And if they buy me lunch, that's even better. But yesterday was Probus. It's an organisation over here, professional and business people together, a lot of them retired. But one of the messages that I give during my talk, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and they're all converted to understand that we're the cause of our drug problems. Our enforcement and prohibition is actually the cause of all the problems that we're experiencing. What I was going to ask you was, in this country, part of my story is that having handed the black market of drugs to criminals, created crime gangs doing that, given them all the marketplace to themselves, basically, where we've got no control whatsoever. We've given them all these resources, all these funds, cash funds that they enjoy. And anybody that knows anything in the world knows that money is power, because money equals corruption. And people who are in possession of millions of pounds and never have to touch drugs or take a chance anymore, they become business people. And they then are able to influence politicians, the police, the court system, the FBI, if we had one over here. They're able to infiltrate our institutions and our democracy at every level they want to. Is that something you can back me up as a genuine warning? Because that sounds like where the mafia got to. That FBI agent might well have been corrupted at that point. We don't know.
I've dealt with hundreds and hundreds of good cops that are as frustrated as I am, because when I go around with my program, every police chief loves me for 24 hours. Then they say, "You'll put us out of business. You'll destroy our budgets. You'll destroy our ongoing investigations. We'll have to lay people off and we won't have any money for our pensions." So it's not bad cops, it's a bad system that cannot survive without money. So criminals don't need police. They can do just fine with nobody. Police, law enforcement cannot survive without criminals. That's their purpose.
That's for sure.
So there are a couple of crooked cops. I knew a couple of them. But out of every 200, there were two bad guys. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have this code blue, code of silence. So 200 good police officers are afraid that they'll be fired on the spot if they turn against the one criminal. And what I try to preach is we hate all police officers because 199 will protect the one bad one. Now, my father in law was a retired lieutenant. Honest as the day is long. He couldn't lie or steal if you gave him directions. But he always said to me, good cops retire at lieutenant or in that range. You cannot become a chief or a captain unless you're willing to lie, play the game, and secure the budgets at all costs. That's in the United States, okay? And there's a gentleman here who became friends with me, Michael Levine. He's world famous. He's a former DEA agent. He's written several books about the failed war on drugs and the big white lie. And he was in many of the United States' largest drug cartel investigations in history. And every step of his career, Washington called him and said, "What are you doing, man? We don't make money winning, we make money fighting. The war on drugs is 50 years old. It's the greatest business plan ever created. Why would you want to win? You'll destroy $1 trillion business. Now, the other thing is criminals are very smart, they're very savvy. We had a Supreme Court judge who worked his ranks up from mafia truck driver to district attorney to prosecutor. And in the 1950s, Time magazine did an article calling him New York's Elliot Ness. He arrested and prosecuted more organized crime figures than anybody in the state of New York in history. Now, if you look at his record, he never investigated or arrested one single person from the Bufalino crime family. He made his career arresting and prosecuting all of their competition.
Brilliant. And that's fact.
And that's a fact. It's not glorious, it's not Hollywood, but it's a fact. And we have several world renowned criminals, Whitey Bulger, White Boy Rick. They were all created by the FBI and turned into criminals because they were petty nobodies that weren't worth arresting. So we created them, we made them popular, and then 20 years later, they were on the most wanted list because we made them worth arresting. Now, you made a comment about we created our own problems. If you know anything about advertising or just any job, when your boss, somebody dies or somebody moves on, they put an ad in the paper looking for 2 employees, and 10 people show up to apply for those jobs. So what we do is we make newspaper headlines, 7 kingpins arrested, $100,000 in cash confiscated, 2,800 packages of heroin confiscated. So you and I and all the old people go, wow, yes, law enforcement got 7 people off the streets. Well, what they did is they just invited 28 new drug dealers to fill those 7 spots, to make $100,000 and to serve those 2,800 people who did not get their heroin that night.
And in the process, created the strife and the violence and the competition that goes on to secure that market, that wee bit of the marketplace that people have been waiting on to step into those shoes. I don't want to go down the drugs route just now. I can tell that you and I are going to go on like a house on fire, Mike, because everything you're saying, you're preaching totally to the converted here. But that's for another day. Let's put that aside just now, and we will explore it and we will get that on record because it's interesting, the parallels. The parallels between here and the States are always very interesting. We tend to be about 10 years behind. But let's go back to you coming back from California when your mum told you what had happened and about the tape and you took the tape in. Let's take it from there.
I grew up in business. I was born into a family business and I know business. So my plan was to use my business experience. The mafia underboss that was in charge at the time my father lost everything had just moved to Florida, about 1,500 miles south of where we live. Now, I knew him because I exterminated his house and his businesses. So I went to Florida. Went to law enforcement in Florida, 1,500 miles away from my home, and I told them my story. And I told them that I understand they don't want me to interfere with their 30-year job security and investments. But I knew a guy that just moved to Florida that I think they would be interested in. their mouths hit the floor when I said his name. And I said, I will hand him to you on a silver platter, but I have to get my father's $1 million first.
You're thinking of the tape that you've got at this
No,
point.
the tape was history. I was thinking of business
Okay.
and greed. So I went to the mafia bosses, the FBI, the state attorney, the Florida State Police, several agencies took me on as a reverse undercover. I called myself a consultant. I was a confidential informant. But I wasn't a criminal trying to save my neck. I was a volunteer citizen. But in their eyes, a stool pigeon's a stool pigeon. So I went to the mob boss's house and he recognized me and I said, Hi, how are you? And he said, What are you doing here? And I said, Well, we have a problem. And he said, What's our problem? I said, Well, the first problem is I'm 25, I'm built like a brick house, and I could probably punch you once and kill you, but I feel sorry for you. And he says, You feel sorry for me? I said, Yeah, your friends in New York told you they robbed my father for $1 million. And he said, I heard that. And I said, Well, Gov, his nickname was Gov, Anthony Gov Guarnieri. I said, Gov, what the shame is you're just an old guy out of sight, out of mind, and your friends didn't tell you that they robbed my father for 2.5 million, and you didn't get your fair share. And just like we're sitting here right now, I could see him and hear him, Honey, get some cookies and coffee. We have company. And he invited me in. So I worked on his greed. And he wanted his 1.5 million that he thought he didn't get. So very early on in the conversation, I got a feeling something wasn't right. And I said to him, I said, Gov, I got to tell you the truth. I went to the FBI 2 days ago because that's what taxpayers do. And I need my security too. And he laughed at me. He put his hand around my shoulder and he said, Mike, you went 4 days ago. I've been waiting for you. I own them in New York and I own them in Florida. He said, but I like you, kid. And you and I are going to make millions of dollars. And we're going to do just what I've been doing for 25 years. We're going to tell them what I want them to think they want to know. So for 3 years, working with law enforcement and posing as a criminal, because Gov was the only one that knew I had law enforcement connections. For 3 years, my job, I told Gov, I said, they're ripping you off. You don't know anything about business. I will take over all of your business interests. I will make sure they're all profitable, and I'll make sure you can rob them all for more money than you are now. And I'll make sure nobody takes advantage of you again. So you'll get all your money. My father will get all of his money. So for 3 years, my job was to take over business interests, make them profitable enough to skim money off the top without putting them out of business. We embezzled, for lack of a better word, over $100 million in business assets in a 3-year period. That $100 million also turned into well over $100 million in drugs and trafficking and other crime, all under the watchful eye of law enforcement. And the reason I was successful was because I never worked for law enforcement. The first thing they told me is, don't tell us what you want to do because we will say no. Tell us what you did and we'll reprimand you. And if you get caught, we'll protect you. Just don't tell us until after it's over. So I was able to do what law enforcement was not able to do because they would have never got permission.
Let me just make sure I've got, because if I've not quite got it, then probably there's, well, maybe everybody else has got it, but that's another story. So you have got a relationship with Gov.
Yes.
He's happy that you're with him because you were honest with him and told him you'd been to see the FBI, which he
Yes.
already knew. So he's taken you into his confidence to a degree because he knows you can't go back to the FBI or law enforcement because he knows you've been there already. Were you not worried that he would get to know that you had this arrangement with law enforcement?
You know, the best way to take advantage of a criminal is to tell them the truth. They would never believe the truth. They'll believe a lie. So he always took it for granted that he could corrupt me. I told him constantly, I just want my father's extra, the 2.5 million when it was only $1 million.
Yeah.
I said, that's all I want. You're not going to recruit me. I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. And he just didn't want to believe that. We were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. He couldn't fathom in his mind that I would not be corrupted by that.
Was this legitimate businesses you were working for?
They were mostly legitimate. Well, IBM. They were raking IBM, stealing all kinds of materials and supplies to the tunes of tens of thousands of dollars a month. The shoe company they were ripping off. We had about 7 or 8 grocery stores. We would go on Friday and give the butchers a little bit of marijuana and a little bit of cocaine, and we would walk out of those grocery stores with $2,000 worth of fish and beef and pork chops and all kinds of food that was already weighed, measured, and priced. Then we would take all those stolen food items to the local restaurants and sell them for half the sticker price. So in the 80s, everybody left the restaurant with a big doggy bag, a to-go bag, because the food was free practically. No matter what business you ran, I didn't want a bad person. I wanted a guy like you who might smoke a joint on Friday night. $5 a week.
Who told you? Who told you that?
That was my philosophy. In the 80s, a 40-year-old guy with a wife and kids who went to church and respected his parents and his aunts and uncles did not want to be labeled a drug addict. So if he smoked $5 joint, one joint a week, I could convince him that I would destroy his life, unless, of course, you give me that $2,000 generator that's over there, leave the lock off of it. Unless, of course, you give me all the hanging beef in the cooler. Unless, of course, so back then, if I targeted a drug addict, he'd quit his job and who cares? But I targeted reputable people with a little tiny bad habit. And they would give me anything their boss had to prevent me from telling their priest, their wife, and their children that they had a drug addiction. It was just business. It was just
okay. Just business. Just business.
And we learned so much more from criminals than criminals ever learned from us.
That's for sure. So just to go over the relationship with you and Gov and law enforcement. What's the law enforcement arrangement then? What are they getting out of this?
They were getting information. They were getting ongoing, growing budgets. Now they went to their superiors and said, hey, we got this kid that's going to hand us Gov Guarneri. We haven't been able to penetrate him for 2 years. Give us $20,000 so we could pay this kid and we can keep our surveillance going. And then as I got deeper and deeper in, they got bigger and bigger budgets to keep me going. If it was up to law enforcement, I would still be working that job 40 years later today. I put an end to it at the end of 3 years. I got my father more than he deserved. I got gubbed more than he deserved. I got shot. And I think it was a day or two after I got shot that I realized this was not fun anymore.
I was going to ask you that, Mike. Wyneri wouldn't have Florida to himself, obviously. Where there's a market, there's rivalries for that market. Was that very much the dynamic in Florida or beyond when you were doing these businesses?
In 1982, Florida was wide open. All the different criminals, the Cubans, the Jamaicans, the drug gangs, the mafia, the Russian mafia, the Irish mafia, everybody was trying to establish their part of Florida. Florida was not yet grabbed by any solid group.
Primarily Miami.
Miami was wide open, but Miami during the Cuban boat crisis, where they had hundreds of thousands of people living under highways, and this is where everything went bad. In the 1980s, they were so desperate for police, they lowered all the standards. You could now smoke pot. You could now have at least 5 misdemeanors and maybe 1 felony. So they pretty much were in such a desperate need for police that they were hiring the criminals to police the criminals.
Yeah, that's how I get in, actually.
And then before 1980, in the Mafia, if I killed you, I would go to jail for 7 years and probably get out in 3.
Okay.
And the Mafia would take care of my business interests, my family, and my kids. But now in the 80s, when you got picked up with drugs, you were going to jail for 25 years. Nobody was going to take care of your business, your wife, and your kids. So all the loyalty went out the window.
Okay.
And when you're facing 25-year sentences, there are no more Hollywood stand-up guys. I'll go to jail and I'll keep my mouth shut. I'm going for 25 years. I'm going to say everything I can about everybody I can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So drugs really destroyed organized crime like the Italians. And the Italians were very afraid of the Cubans, the Jamaicans, because the Italians tried not to involve your wife and kids. The Jamaicans, the Colombians, they would kill your dog first, then your children, and then your mother and father and make you watch.
Yeah.
And the Italians had no stomach for that.
Tell us about getting shot.
It's almost too stupid to tell. They hired a guy from New Jersey who at that time was about 320 pounds. I was young and fit. So this 320-pound hitman was going to bust into my apartment door thinking that the bolt lock was on, maybe a chain, and who knows. When he hit that door like a bull, I was opening the door at that exact same moment. So, needless to say, the door hit me. He fell on top of me. I was wearing 3 guns. I had a shoulder holster, I had one in the back of my pants belt, and I had one on my ankle. When he hit me so hard that we went flying through my living room and my dining room, and his gun went sliding across the floor. I didn't think about my 3 guns. I was crawling for his gun. All right. I'm very proud until this moment. He got the gun first. I slapped it out of his hand. It was a revolver. When the gun hit the floor, it shot me in the shin and came out my calf. So I didn't even know I was shot. Now, the sad part of that story is within seconds, every law enforcement agency in South Florida was in my apartment. I found out days later. They knew the guy was hired to kill me. They knew he was coming to kill me. And they were in the parking lot taking bets. I'm putting my money on Mike, and we got a good, clean murder attempt. I'm putting my money on the hitman, and we got a good murder attempt. I'm putting my money that they kill each other, and it's 2 pains in the necks off of our books.
Yeah, that would be long odds, but worth a punt. Worth a punt.
Yeah. So, at that point, my father had all of his money plus, Gov had all of his money plus, and I just said, "That's it. 3 years, everybody's paid. I have no interest, and I'm going home."
Who wanted you dead, Mike? I take it was a hitman coming to kill you. I take it that was the
Well,
scenario.
yeah, I found out later, years later, that there were 5 bona fide hits put on me.
Right.
And when it was told to me, he said, "Don't let your head swell. You got a flat tire one night. You went to the wrong address the other night.
Yeah. Yeah.
So don't think you were any great,
Evading
um,
these things.
so what happened was early on with Gov, he took me to several mob families, explained the situation, and they pretty much gave me permission to do anything I wanted with Gov's crew. But they all told me, "You come in our territory, you'll be dead tomorrow morning." So as the 3 years went on, I met more and more and more people, and obviously overstepped my boundaries.
Yeah.
So it was people that I didn't even know about that, Gov didn't want me dead. He was making a lot of money.
Yeah. Where did you live at that point? Was it Miami?
I lived in Fort Lauderdale,
Right.
which is right by
Yeah.
North
Yeah.
Miami. We did business all over the country, back and forth to New York, back and forth to Las Vegas, back and forth to California. Gov had business interests all over the country. By the grace of God, I'm alive today. But also my name, Bonventre, is the name of a 1920s mafia guy from Italy who was the biggest in history. And I think I got away with a lot of stuff because the wise guys kind of thought, "Oh, maybe he's connected to the real guy."
Yeah. Yeah. And were you?
No, no. As a matter of fact, I have a cousin in Italy who was a prosecutor in all the big European mob trials.
Okay.
And then I got a few cousins that were on trial.
Okay.
But I never met them. My grandfather was a factory worker and he hated the mafia. Boy, if he ever found out you were connected with the mafia, he would disown you. So he was a good, honest, hardworking guy who sponsored families from Italy. And he said, if, to my father, my father had 7 brothers and sisters. And he used to say, every time the kids left the house, my grandfather would say, "Do what you want. Do not disgrace your family name." And that's how they were brought up, and that's how I was brought up.
Is your dad still with us, Mike?
Yes, yes. He's 91.
How much of this story does he know? Does he know all this?
Yeah, he knows that it was really a big strain on us because he's a very proud man, and I think it really bothered him that I risked my life to bail him out of something he should have been protecting us from.
Yeah.
That was always a strain between him and I, pride wise. And then I had to convince everybody during that 3 years, all my relatives, I had to convince them that I lost my mind and became a criminal.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford to have my aunt sitting in a restaurant saying, "Oh, by the way, my nephew works with law enforcement." So you can imagine after I came home, it took me almost 3 years to convince everybody I really wasn't a, a criminal.
Mike, I worked undercover for a number of years, and it probably took me a year to convince myself that I really was a policeman when I came back.
Yeah, that's the sad part of it all. is I was really disgusted that I was a better cop than most cops, but I was also a better criminal than most criminals.
I think it's the hardest bit for me to talk about it because on Crime Time Inc. we've done a few attempts at episodes about my undercover work, and it's very, very difficult because you realise the lies that were told and the deceit. I think the saddest part is you realise how much you enjoyed it as well.
Well, see, that was it. I was 25, 26, 27, 28 years old. I lived in topless dance joints. I went out for the best dinners. I had a fantastic boat. You know, that's what young boys' dreams are made of.
Correct.
Until they get shot.
And we called it work. We called it work.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Mike, let me ask you a question then, because another Hollywood thing is that there's always this feeling that it's impossible to get out. You know that saying that you never get out once you're into the criminal world, especially at that level that you were at with Gov. How did you get out?
I got out at that time when law enforcement wanted me to testify. I said I will not testify because if I do, I will tell everybody we entrapped them.
Yes.
And I will blow your entire case.
Yeah.
So just leave me alone. Use what you use. So I had the respect of the old wise guys that wish they had a son as devoted to them as I was to my father. There really was honor among thieves pre 80s. So I never worried about anybody trying to hurt me after the trials. I always worried about law enforcement wanting to shut me up about how little respect I had for them after the 3 years.
Okay.
So the last 40 years, I'm told once a year, twice a year by some police officer, we're going to arrest you for obstruction of justice. And I just smile and say, please do. I would love to be on CNN and the nightly news telling everybody I got arrested for doing what you get paid not to do. I also think I'm safe because, well, most people are dead now, 40 years later. But also the people that are still alive that might not like me probably want to make sure I never stub my toe. Because if I die, I think they're afraid that the book is coming out with all their names and addresses.
And is it?
So, you know, again, it's a business move.
Yeah.
How do you secure your job?
Yeah, of course. Much better just having you roaming the world innocently just now, talking to people like me, than to risk anything happening to you.
I'll get a call next week and I'll look at my wife and say, just when I thought I was getting out, they pulled me back in again.
So, Mike, that's 40 years since you got out. Is that right? The 80s, mid-80s?
Yes. 1982, I went in. And in 1986, I came out.
Okay.
So I say 1982 to 2022 was 40 years.
And since then, what have you been doing?
I'm the person that you call when the drugs in your neighborhood are out of control and the police will not do anything. You call me. I came up with a plan, and Mike Levine, how to get rid of drug traffic in your neighborhood in 48 to 72 hours. Again, it's business.
Yes.
I don't go after drug dealers because they have guns and they're vicious. I go after their customers. So if you had a shoe repair shop and I stood out front of your business telling everybody that they were going to get athlete's feet and lose their foot, how long do you think you would be in business?
Okay.
If I told every restaurant customer they're going to get food poisoning, how long do you think the restaurant will be in business? So what we do is we send anonymous letters to the neighborhood saying, don't go outside next Friday and accidentally get shot during the big raid. So now everybody knows that there's going to be a raid. Then we put signs up on the street at 3 a.m. that say, drug dealers on this street are police informants. Please smile and speak clearly. So within 48 hours, the drug dealers are on the front porches going, "Where's the customers? How come nobody's coming?" Now, within 72 hours, we'll see a narcotics detective talking to the drug dealer saying, "If you want your free get out of jail card, you better start selling some drugs. So if you can't do it here, you better move to some place where you can." I used to joke with my wife 10 years ago. I'd say, I can retire right now. I can go to Boston and rip off a drug dealer for $500,000. I won't have to work for 3 years. Then I can go to another city. There's 50 states. But now that's not so possible because I'd say probably most of the drugs belong to law enforcement and is part of some long term investigation. So I wouldn't be ripping off drug dealers, I'd be ripping off law enforcement. So let's end this on a positive note. When we get to the end, let's be positive. This is still a great time to be alive, and drugs can be avoided. Like anything else, if you want trouble, you can find it.
Mike, I want to come to the end of this story with the mob, etc. So I want to round that off now. You're quite right, but I think it's only the start of what I want to talk to you about the war on drugs and about how law enforcement goes about that enforcement, how that perpetuates the marketplace and the criminal underworld, and how that feeds the industry that has now become, and that includes rehabilitation and all the chemists that make fortunes out of supplying drugs to help people get off drugs, etc., etc. So let's park that for a minute, because I think you and I are going to have a really eye-opening conversation about that. Eye-opening for me, because again, you guys are ahead from what we can expect to happen here. Because as long as we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to keep getting the same results, and it's only going to end up further down the road the results of what you're seeing just now. It's got a natural conclusion to it where we lose control of the streets entirely, and our industries and our politicians and our courts because of corruption and whatnot. But let's park it aside and go back to
Yes.
the 28-year-old now going to make a life for himself doing something else. Were you trouble-free from then on? Were you ever tempted to dip your foot back in again? Look at the contacts that you'd made in those 3 years, Mike. Come on.
Well, actually, I never left. I became a consultant. So when I came out, I went to all the businesses that were being robbed and I said, "Listen, I've been robbing you for the last 3 years in the name of the law. Let me teach you how to keep your businesses drug free and profitable and get rid of all the people that have been undermining you."
Okay.
So I did that as an obligation, a moral obligation. And eventually, a millionaire heard about me and he called me and he said, "How much do you charge?" And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" And in the early days after I came out from Undercover, people would hire me to pretend I was an employee.
Okay. Yeah.
Then I would go into their business, figure out who's doing what and how they're doing it.
Yep.
Then I would report back, fire these 10 people. I'll write your policy and procedure. I'll tell you how to prevent them from getting back in. And, so normally when somebody hired me, it was a 90-day job.
Okay. Yeah.
And I just became a consultant. But then always on the side, I was undermining law enforcement acceptable collateral damage.
Yeah.
When somebody came to me and said, "My neighborhood is out of control, the police won't do anything, the drugs are getting worse, what can you do?" And I would say, 72 hours, they'll all be gone. Now, you got to stay anonymous because the police will not like you for
No.
upsetting what they're doing. Now, the problem with that is I come to your neighborhood, I clean it up in 72 hours. But you and I just forced all those drug dealers and all those buyers to go to a brand new innocent neighborhood that never had that problem before. It's just a big vicious circle.
Or they go to an area that's already got a marketplace, it's already got a dealers in place, and we start a tough war. So we used to say that you don't change the size of the market, you change the shape of the market with enforcement. Because we used to do that, and we could close down an area for drug supply just by sheer force of numbers and activity. And nobody knew where we were coming from, and they were scared. They were scared we were going to fit them up. They were scared we were going to do anything at all. But nobody went without drugs, Mike. That's the bottom line. None of the users went without. They just went elsewhere. So we kept shifting the problem about, but not affecting the major problem that we had. Let's talk about drugs another time, because there's too much to unwrap in there. And we need to do it kind of systematically so that our listeners at Crime Time Inc. can start to understand the real issues that are involved.
Well, I'm going to take the place of your grandfather, and I'm going to tell you what we did wrong for the last 10 years.
Okay.
So you don't spend the next 10 years catching up to us to find out it doesn't work.
Okay. Brilliant. Brilliant. And I know that a lot of cops listen to these, so the young cops. And if I tell you this, Mike, we did a talk as LEAP. We did a talk to the Scottish Superintendents Association. We've done two. The one we did about 6 months ago. I always ask for a vote at the start of every meeting for people who think that enforcement should be tougher, that we should come down harder, that we should be locking people up for longer. And in the type of places that we speak, it's very conservative generally. It's business people, it's upstanding members of society. And there's used to be about 90 to 95% would raise their hand. And our objective during the next 20 or 30 minutes is to do another straw poll at the end and see the result. And usually we had turned the room round to about maybe 20% still thinking that, because they've heard that story for 53 years and the rhetoric is very rough from our politicians. But now, yesterday, for example, when I did my talk, there was 40 to 45 people. And at the beginning, I estimated 60 to 60, 70% were in favour of prohibition. And at the end, there was only one guy in the room that raised his hand. I spoke to him afterwards. It turned out he was a pharmacist who has got a vested interest in the war on drugs because of the supplementary drugs that they give out. That aside, that's the difference. And when we did it to the Superintendents Association, I asked that question first and foremost. Now, this is the leadership. This is the Chief Constable was there. This is the leadership of the police in Scotland, UK, and not one raised their hand to say that prohibition was sustainable or effective. Not one. Normally we're on the defensive and we have to give them stats and give them reasons. All of a sudden our speech had to change entirely because they were already agreeing with us. We started to speak about what we would do with the resources that would free up in our criminal justice system. We could actually intervene in people's lives and help them make different choices and get clean and get jobs and get housing and all the things that we know are the cause of people using drugs in the first place. So we're going to come back to that.
Yeah, I work with a lot of ex-convicts. And honestly, if I got in trouble, I can't imagine how I would ever get on the right track again.
Yeah.
The system
Yeah.
will not allow you to better yourself.
Especially drugs, because you're criminalised immediately.
Right.
I don't talk
Exactly.
about decriminalising drugs. I talk about decriminalising people. And 90% of people that use drugs recreationally and never have a problem with it.
That's right.
That talk that I did yesterday, Mike, you create a good atmosphere. So we had a laugh as well. You've got to have a laugh because that's what people remember. And we've got a sports occasion coming up. It's called the Scottish Cup Final. It's soccer for you guys. It's like your Super Bowl. It's for us in Scotland. And it's the two biggest rivals, Rangers and Celtic, who are divided culturally, religiously, all sorts of. It's a real poisonous atmosphere, actually, between the two. And it causes so many social problems here in Scotland. That's another subject entirely. But I said to the audience yesterday, think about the Scottish Cup final. They were asking me about cannabis use and how it's a gateway drug and stuff, all that old nonsense. And I said, well, imagine that the crowd that go to watch Rangers and Celtic in 3 weeks' time, imagine instead of going to the pub, instead of going for drink beforehand, they all had a joint. Think how that would change the atmosphere within the stadium. And we were all having a laugh about that, you know. They would all be, "Hi, how you doing, brother? All right, yeah, man. What was the score anyway?"
Yeah. And next season, everybody would be 20 pounds heavier because they would eat. They would eat instead of drink.
Brilliant, mate. That's a brilliant note to leave it on just now. Well, that was quite some story from New York State here on Crime Time Inc. I must apologise. Firstly, Mike will be joining us again, I've absolutely no doubt, because some of the information there about the war on drugs is quite fascinating. And I'm sure that we'll chat with him again in the future. And hopefully at that time, my co-host Tom Wood, who you may well have noticed wasn't with me tonight, maybe you didn't, will join me obviously in future, but Tom was busy today. He's got his book launch in a couple of days' time. The World's End Murders, The Inside Story, is launching this week at Hillhead Library, Sunday at 2 p.m. It's the 23rd of June. So hopefully a lot of you are going along there. And I've got some hot news off the press about our very first live Crime Time Inc. podcast, which is coming very soon. But I'll leave that to Tom on Sunday. He's going to announce it on Sunday and give out some information about that event that's going to be in the West End of Glasgow. Our West End debut, if you like. So on that note, I'll thank Mike again for his time tonight. That was a very interesting story that I'll need to delve into a wee bit more because, to be honest, it's a different world from the States from what we're used to here. But true crime nonetheless. And you heard it here first on Crime Time Inc. Next time on Crime Time Inc.
It's quite interesting that the officer that was involved in this initially, he was actually very young in service. He was in his probation, working in the Gorbals area at Glasgow, which at that time in Glasgow was a particularly violent and infamous part of the city, the Gorbals. It was well renowned for its violence. So he was out, just had his breakfast, he was back out onto the beat when he heard the sound of breaking glass and all the shrieking and shouting. And so he ran towards it, and as he turned a corner there he saw two men. One of the men would appear to have got the upper hand on the other and was aiming several blows at the person. Now he could see something in his hand but wasn't quite sure what it was, and as the cop got closer he could see actually this was a knife that the chap had in his hand, and he was striking the fellow with a knife several times. So the officer, as you'd done at the time, no radios, there was nothing, no communication systems, only a whistle.